In 1994, a movie came along about a man of low intelligence who happens to hit a few lucky breaks, weaving himself in and out of the timeline of American history and into the hearts of millions of moviegoers. That man is Forrest Gump. For the month of February, I'll be focusing episode topics on historical and pop culture references in the movie, ones you may have missed when watching the film because of the overwhelming emotion attached to every scene, or ones you may only be familiar with on the surface. In this episode, we'll talk about the history behind desegregation in schools, Alabama Governor Wallace and the reasons for his stance, and how this was a leading factor to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This episode may not be suitable for all listeners. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind the stand in the Schoolhouse Door. But first, a quick message. Do you have any superstitions you believe in? Come on, it doesn't have to be as obvious as not walking under a ladder or not stepping on a crack. It could be as harmless as growing a playoff beard or being a little more cautious on Friday the 13th. I'll be working on an upcoming series for March, and I'd love to hear your stories. Record a clip letting me know your superstitions, and if you're a podcaster, be sure to include the name of your show. You can email them to thestorybehindpod@gmail.com. And also forward this podcast to 10 of your friends, or bad luck will befall you. Just kidding. Or am I?
Federal troops enforcing a court order integrated the University of Alabama today. 2 Negroes were admitted, but only after Governor George Wallace had carried out his symbolic threat to stand in the schoolhouse door.
Governor Wallace, I take it from that statement that you're going to stand in that
What's going on?
Coons are trying to get into school.
Coons? Well, raccoons trying to get on our back porch. Mama just chased them off with a broom.
Not raccoons, you idiot. And they want to go to school with us.
With us? They do?
Shortly after Governor Wallace had carried out his promise to block the doorway, President Kennedy ordered the Secretary of Defense then to use military force. And so at day's end, the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa had been desegregated, and students Jimmy Hood and Vivian Malone had been signed up for summer classes.
Ma'am, you dropped your book. Ma'am.
Segregation has unfortunately been a part of history since humans first learned to classify themselves and others. Whether it's different tribes of Indians, fans of different sports teams, or different skin colors, it's a natural human instinct to classify one another. In 1892, Homer Plessy was riding a train in Louisiana. Plessy was an African American, and per Louisiana law, he was required to sit in a Jim Crow car, but he didn't, stating his constitutional rights were violated by this law. But the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the state laws of segregation did not conflict with the 13th and 14th Amendments, the amendments that, respectively, abolished slavery and defined anyone born in or naturalized in the U.S. as a citizen. This ruling upheld segregation as separate but equal in 1896, and it was used for decades to justify the segregation of schools, courtrooms, even water fountains, anything that could be segregated. As long as the facilities were considered equal, segregation was upheld. In the 1930s, the NAACP began bringing lawsuits to court on behalf of black families from Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware, hoping to desegregate schools. One such case was that of Linda Brown, a third grader in Topeka, Kansas, who had to walk 6 blocks to catch a bus to her designated black school, when a designated white school was only 7 blocks away. When the case went to the Supreme Court, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiff, Oliver Brown, who was Linda's father, stating separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Following the result of the Brown v. Board of Education case, public schools were federally mandated to integrate. But this didn't sit well in some states. After the Brown v. Board of Education ruling declared segregation illegal, Alabama, as well as a few other southern states, began passing local laws to try to circumvent the ruling. They gave power to school boards and superintendents to place students in schools according to criteria like academic background, transportation, and ability. State Senator Albert Boutwell wrote Amendment 111, known as the Freedom of Choice Law, in 1956. This law made it so parents could choose where their children went to school within the district. What also ended up occurring were a number of private schools popping up around the country, predominantly in southern states like Alabama, Mississippi, Virginia, and Arkansas. The tuition-based schools created a loophole for anti-segregation parents looking to send their children to white-only schools. Many of these private schools, known colloquially as segregation academies, waived tuition for white families who couldn't afford it. By the way, if you think this is a product of the past, there are still a number of these private schools left, filled predominantly with white students. Following this, the U.S. District Judge Frank M. Johnson Jr. overturned the Freedom of Choice and Pupil Placement Act and ordered all non-integrated public schools in Alabama to admit black students. When George Wallace was inaugurated as governor of Alabama in 1963, his address included the slogan, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And in June of that year, he made good on his promise when two black students, Vivian Malone and James A. Hood, tried to register for classes at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Federal employees were on hand, knowing the governor's stance on integrating the university, and they even had dogs present and guards trained to physically remove the governor from where he was standing, which was right in the main entrance, blocking Malone and Hood from entering. As he stood in the doorway, he challenged the federal government for taking away the rights of states to pass laws, as the Constitution provides states with the sovereignty to do so.
There has been no legislative action by Congress justifying this intrusion. When the Constitution of the United States was enacted, a government was formed upon the premise that people as individuals are endowed with the rights of life, liberty, and property, and with the right of local self-government. The people and their local self-government formed a central government and conferred upon it certain and limited powers. All other powers were reserved to the states and to the people. Strong local government is the foundation of our system and must be continually guarded and maintained.
Wallace finally stepped aside when President John F. Kennedy ordered the Alabama National Guard to the campus to remove him as necessary. Vivian Malone and James A. Hood were then allowed to enter the building and register for classes. Malone became the first African American to graduate from the University of Alabama 2 years later. With his orders to remove Wallace from the schoolhouse doors, President Kennedy showed his stance on civil rights, and that incident was a watershed moment that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, proposed by Kennedy and later signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. The act banned segregation on the grounds of race, religion, or national origin in public places. This act also barred employers from discriminating against a person based on their race, religion, sex, or national origin. Among the other tenets of this act was the forbidding of federal funds from going toward any discriminatory program. The Civil Rights Act was added to by expanding its reach to cover the disabled and elderly. It was also expanded to ban voting practices designed to discriminate, such as literacy tests, like we talked about in the story behind secret ballots. Information for this episode was sourced from pbs.org, npr.org, history.com, The Atlantic, and more links, which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. Follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StoryBehindPod, or subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.